Learn all about how you can protect your sensitive data in Azure SQL Database, including an interesting assessment that will actually tell you how you're doing. This week on Data Exposed SQL Insider Edition. Hi, I'm Anna Hoffman, and welcome to this episode of Data Exposed SQL Insider Edition. Today, I have joining with us Manish Kumar. Manish, thanks so much for coming on the show. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Sure, Anna. First of all, thanks for having me here. I work as a senior cloud solution architect at Microsoft. I'm based out in London, and I work very closely with our customers and help them in modernizing their data platform to our cloud.
Awesome. Well, it's great to have you on the show. SQL Insider
Thank you.
Series is great for folks who haven't seen it before because we get experts like Manish who are actually working with customers, implementing these solutions with customers, come on and tell us tips and tricks and the things that they've learned through, kind of being on the ground with our customers. So it's great to have you on. Today, we're going to be talking about protecting sensitive data with Azure SQL Database. And I know that this is something you do a lot with customers, Manish. I'd love if you could tell us a little bit more about some of the scenarios you're seeing and some of the things that you've learned.
Yeah, so Anna, I can say data security in cloud is one of the most important aspects that must be considered and well architected. Today, I'm going to run through a few key security considerations for cloud databases and how the features integrated with Azure SQL Database helps our customers to achieve their compliance requirements and keep their sensitive data secure using Azure SQL DB. So let me share my screen so that I can talk through a few of those security considerations. I've come up with one single slide, so let me share my screen.
Awesome. Let's take a look.
So let's start with how you can access your data securely. Azure SQL does not support deploying directly into a virtual network, but it does come with a number of ways using which you can connect your Azure SQL database you can securely connect your applications to Azure SQL database. Now, to start with, it is highly advisable to create a private endpoint as it is more secure than a public endpoint. So try to configure a private endpoint for server using private link to access Azure SQL database securely. If possible, set deny public network access to yes. Now, this will allow only connections via the private endpoints. All connections coming through the public endpoint will be denied if this configuration is on. Also, make sure that the client machines uses the latest supported version of TLS, that stands for Transport Layer Security, to connect to Azure SQL Database. We currently support TLS 1.0, 1.1, and 1.2. And it is highly recommended that if you are using an old driver of TLS, try to upgrade it to at least to version 1.2. And if you're configuring a firewall, then it is highly recommended to go with the VNet firewall rules instead of IP firewall rules. This will allow your traffic only to come through your subnet. So whatever the resources are there within your subnet can get access to your Azure SQL database. Now, the next one would be the access control. And as you know, authentication and authorization are the two most important aspects when you're trying to implement access control. By authentication, we confirm that someone is who they claim to be, while authorization is a process of determining which level of access you're going to grant to each user. So it is always recommended that you try and avoid using SQL authentication unless you really need to, and try and manage all the identities centrally using using Azure Active Directory. Also, if possible, add AD multi-factor authentication. This adds an additional security layer, and try and avoid password-based authentications. If there is a strong reason for you to use password-based authentication, then I would say that your passwords and the secrets must be secured using Azure Key Vault. Also, try and monitor your AD audit logs, information about any changes that has been applied to your tenant, such as any users and group managements or updates applied to your tenant resources. Then let's talk about authorization. So your user can authenticate to your system, can connect to your database. Now, what privileges that user should have to access your data, whether he should be having access all the database, all the data which resides within your database, or less. So it is highly recommended that that your users must be provided with the least privileges to complete their task. And it is recommended that never provide any direct permissions to the users. Always try and create a custom base roles with the exact permissions needed. So I would also highly recommend you to put a process in place to regularly review access from high privileged accounts in your audit logs. Row level security is another way to implement access control. RLS enables you to restrict row level access based on a user identity, based on the user's identity, what role a user has been performing, or execution context. It is also recommended to mask your sensitive data from the non-privileged users. So you can configure dynamic data masking for that. So dynamic data masking is basically a policy-based security feature that masks your sensitive data on the fly. Remember, your data is not masked when it is stored in database. It gets masked on the fly when a non-privileged user is trying to access it. Remember that any privileged users like DBA will always see that data into a plain text. And if you have a super sensitive information, then we would recommend to go ahead with the always encrypted, which I'll discuss in a minute. So the third point, which I would say that we must always consider while designing a security for your databases is protecting data using encryption. Now, Azure SQL DB actually uses transparent data encryption to encrypt your data at rest. Now, encryption at rest means that your data is cryptographically protected when it sits within the database or in a log file, or in the whenever or even when it is in the backup files. So you must always keep your TDE enabled to keep your data encrypted while at rest. Azure SQL DB has a TDE enabled by default with service managed keys.
One question on that, Manish, you said it's TDE with service managed keys. Some folks or a lot of organizations are implementing BYOK or bring your own key. Is that something you could do? Is that what you recommend for TDE? What's your insight there?
Yes, Anna, if a customer wants to have more granular control over TDE keys, then it can be easily configured in Azure Key Vault as a customer managed keys. It comes with few benefits as well. I mean, it helps in centrally manage their TDE keys, TDE protectors with other keys as well, and also rotate their TDE keys with other keys which they have in their key vault. Normally, customers do have a key rotation policy. So all the keys can be rotated at the same time based on their policy. Another benefit of bringing their own key is that in a case of a security event, they can revoke the permissions in Azure Key Vault, and that makes your database inaccessible. So that is another big benefit if a customer wants to bring their own key, and that gives a granular control over the TDE keys. So hope it answers. And the next one would be TLS, which we already discussed. So moving forward, as I said, your super sensitive data or the sensitive data must never be stored in a plain text, because the high privileged users can always read through your data. High privileged users like DBA can always see your data. So it is recommended to encrypt your data using always encrypted, and always try to manage the always encrypted keys with role separation. So it should not be that the same person is being assigned as a DBA role and assigned as a security administrator role. It should be, the role must be separated between different people, so that DBA has an access to database, but he doesn't have an access to Azure Key Vault or the actual keys. And the security administrator have an access to the actual keys, but it doesn't have access to the database itself. You should also be using the strongest cipher available for data encryption. Now, a customer should try avoiding using any of the deprecated ciphers like DES, triple DES, RC4, as they have been some known vulnerabilities. Also, if you're storing your encryption keys like customer managed TD keys or always encrypted master keys in Azure Key Vault, it is important that the keys gets rotated periodically based on company's rotation policy or the compliance policy. The next key security design consideration, which I would want you to consider, is around monitoring, compliance, and governance. So start with configuring audit logs in Azure SQL DB. The audit logs get stored in storage accounts. So make sure to restrict the access to the storage account where the logs are stored. Also, in general, make it ensure that wherever the database is interacting your storage account, that part is restricted, and the access is given only to who needs that access. Also try and analyze the audit logs and investigate for any historical activities, any potential threats, any security violations that happen, because that all gets logged within your audit logs. Now, once audit log has been taken care of, then the next important step would be to configure your Azure SQL database to identify and tag your sensitive data so that it can be tracked who all access your company's sensitive data. Now, that can be achieved very easily using data discovery and classification feature of Azure SQL DB. This is a built-in feature. It helps you with a list of columns which it thinks is sensitive and must be classified. And once you classified it, whenever anyone tries to access that data or accesses that data, it gets captured into audit log, and that audit log should always be investigated for a security violations, as I mentioned before. Now, another important security consideration would be to enable your Azure Defender to get vulnerability assessment and threat protection on. So vulnerability assessment is actually, it compares your database configurations against the rules and the best practice based on Microsoft best practices, and then reports it back as a deviation from the best practices. So you can take an action on them. You do get remediation plans and everything in vulnerability assessment when you see a failure. Then enabling your Azure Defender also switches on advanced threat protection, which integrates alerts with Azure Security Center. And you get alerted during various security threats like SQL injection attacks or change in the access pattern, like someone trying to access your data from unusual geographical location or unusual Azure data center, or you're getting abnormally high failed sign-ins, or someone is trying to do a brute force attack and all those things. So you'll get alerted if any of those things happen. There are quite few others as well. Now, I've discussed few of the important security best practices which must be taken care of. Now let's jump into Microsoft assessment. So I always advise my customers that once you design your security, design other pillars as well, then go and do a Microsoft assessment and see if we have forgotten something. Is any best practices been missed? So I'll just show you from where customer does a Microsoft assessment, or whoever doesn't know will come to know. So let me jump into Microsoft assessment page. Now in Microsoft's assessment page, you can see today I'm going to do a Microsoft assessment of security pillar of Azure SQL DB. So that falls under data service. I'll get into it. It prepares an assessment and it says, it puts a name, a lovely name over here. You can always change it accordingly. Otherwise, this looks good enough for me. So I'll just go and see if these security considerations which we discuss is good enough. So I'll click on data service because Azure SQL DB falls there. Click on next. There are 4 databases where you can run your review, and I'm going to run it on Azure SQL DB. You can run it for SQL Server on VM, Cosmos DB, and managed instance. So I'll select the first one. Now it says in well-architected framework, there are 5 pillars. And I would recommend anyone who is using Azure SQL DB or any other service must go and carry out the assessment for all pillars. For today's session, we'll just cover the security, but it is highly recommended that someone who is implementing it must carry out all the pillars. So I'll go next in the security, and then you'll see few questions coming up and few considerations. So whatever you have considered, just tick it. Whatever you haven't, leave it as of now. So we discussed about restricting access to storage account, discussed about sensitive data not stored in plain text, data masking as well. So we'll check these things. We discussed about Azure Defender, best practices. We didn't do these. Keys must be rotated. Regularly reviewing your high privileged audit logs, audit and enforce policy compliance. So we discussed about all of these. Going next, we discussed about encrypting data between, this is the TLS one. We discussed about TDE, storing keys in Azure Key Vault and rotating it periodically using strongest cipher, and considering managed, always encrypted with role separation. So we considered all these in our security design. SQL authentication must be avoided. Running an activity report on Azure AD group manage membership changes. Security principle must not be applied directly. We did talk about custom.
So Manish, hate to interrupt you, but is this just a way that you can check, like, hey, have I done these things? And if I haven't, it looks like there's a little question mark, so I can go learn more about how to do these things?
True. So this is more of a review. So once you have designed your application, architected your Azure SQL database, it is more of you're confirming by running a Microsoft assessment that you have considered all the best practices which Microsoft recommends, and that is based on 5 different pillars. So it is more of a checking that have you missed anything, and at the end you get a result, and it tells you that, okay, this is your score. I'll show you in a minute. This is a score where you stand and what are the discrepancies and what you should be doing with all the links and everything. So let's get into the final thing, and I'll show you that as well. So we did talk about Key Vault, multi-factor authentication, RLS and least privileges. Let's get into another next page. I'm just quickly running through all those questions. This is a question about securing your network. So we did talk about TLS, creating private endpoint, denying public network to on, and considering private endpoint or VNet firewalls over IP firewalls. And the last one is about ensuring your critical accounts are protected or not. We didn't discuss any of those, so I'll just leave it blank and click on the view guidance. So view guidance comes back with a score. So it says that your result is 43 out of 55, and it is green. So it is in the excellent range at the end. And if you go down, it says your SQL DB security is excellent, but there are 5 recommendations. So if you click on show more, it comes back with a score out of 100. So it is 86 out of 100, which lands in a green zone. If you haven't taken enough security considerations, it may come down in critical or moderate with a lot of recommended actions. So you can see all these actions over here. If we click any of those, it opens our Microsoft Docs and gives more details about what exactly it is. and what you should be doing to configure those features. So that is how you'll get a Microsoft assessment result, and it gives you a very good score and a very clear recommendation list with all the URLs of and the help you would need.
Yeah.
So
this is really awesome. I had never seen this before, actually. So I'm glad that you showed us this. It really takes it into the next level of like, okay, these are all the things I need to know. Now let me actually evaluate, am I doing them? Are there things that I'm missing, and where can I learn more? So Manish, I really just wanted to thank you for coming on the show. This has been a really interesting episode. I learned a lot. I think our viewers probably did as well. To our viewers, we'll put a link in the description for some resources so you can learn more. If you like this episode, go ahead and give it a like, leave us a comment, and let us know what you think. And we hope to see you next time on Data Exposed.